Hello and welcome to JURIST. Today, jurist journalist Khushali Mahajan will be in conversation with Brian Earp, who's currently an associate director at Yale-Hastings Program in Ethics and Health Policy at Yale University. Brian Earp is a bioethicist and a philosopher who's known for his writings in intersex medical interventions, circumcisions, and drug use in United States of America. Sit back, relax, and enjoy this
We're
interview.
really honored to have you over here with us. And we are very, very impressed by your contribution to bioethics as a field of research. So, just to kick this interview off, can you tell us a little about your interest in bioethics? How was the inspiration behind it?
Sure. Well, I'm interested in a lot of different things, but one thing I like about bioethics is that it applies issues in moral philosophy, questions of how we should live and how we should treat each other, to specific, concrete, sometimes messy issues. So, in my training in philosophy, often we would use these abstract thought experiments to try to clarify moral principles, and that was all well and good. But sometimes it was hard to know how to translate that to the real world. And bioethics came about in an era where people were making, from the beginning, real life decisions that had sometimes life and death implications. And so it wasn't enough to stay in the armchair, so to speak, but rather you had to figure out how were we going to have a detailed empirical grasp on a specific phenomenon. And so because much of my training is also in science, I found this wonderful field where I could both try to apply the skills of understanding descriptively what's happening, being able to read scientific papers, for example, being able to draw on different disciplines like anthropology and sociology and gender studies and so forth. But then also, rather than simply trying to describe the world, come up with moral arguments for how could we make the world better. And so I find that enterprise really fascinating and keeps me going.
That's really amazing. So, what exactly is your core area of research in bioethics?
Well, probably have a couple of core areas. So one has to do with issues around sex and gender and also children's rights and bodily integrity, which is how these genital cutting practices are sometimes researched from that angle. Another is neuroethics. So I do a lot of work on biotechnologies that affect our brain chemistry or our central nervous system in some way, which can change our subjective experiences, change our sense of self. So I've written a book with my co-author, Julian Savulescu, which is called Love Drugs. And it's about how medications can affect our romantic relationships, partly through their effects on our brains. And so that's maybe another major area that I focus on.
That's really great. So your core area of interest is sex and circumcision and the rights of children.
That's the area that I focus on the most. Yes.
Okay. So since JURIST is largely a legal forum and most of our readers and our audiences are law students, young law students. So how do you think bioethics and the law converge? At which plane do they converge?
Well, the law is partly a normative enterprise in that it sets certain rules for how people should behave, or at least how they must behave if they aren't to face certain consequences or sanctions legally. And so the relationship between the law and moral questions in bioethics is complicated. For example, you might have a law that is meant to govern behavior in a society that purports to be moral and that it's making a claim on how people should behave. But then you might have a bioethicist who looks at the law and critiques it and says the law itself is ethically problematic, or the law itself is based on assumptions that we should question. So an example is in the United States and in many countries, we have a prohibition against drug use that isn't considered medical. And the way that this law is implemented is often in a very racist manner, where people from Black and brown communities are shoveled into incarceration on a much wider scale than people who engage in similar drug use in white communities. And so some people think that part of the problem is the law itself, that the law is unjustified. It shouldn't be the case that people should face criminal sanctions for using drugs if they don't harm other people, for example. So bioethics can critique law, It can also look to law for inspiration for moral questions because the law, again, emerges out of social processes that are at least theoretically interested in the moral question of how should we behave, how should we organize ourselves as a society, and how should we coordinate our behavior so that we can live together and hopefully flourish.
So, as far as genital mutilation and genital cutting is concerned, so there's, as far as my understanding goes, which is very amateur, but so part of it is for medical reasons. And then there's also a very big social dimension to it, a very big religious dimension to it. So, how does bioethics as a subject approach the social dimension, and how does it differentiate it from the medical dimension?
One point to make about medicine, and a point that bioethicists will often make, is that as an institution, medicine is a social process. It's something that exists in a historical and cultural context. So sometimes people would like to think of medicine as something that transcends culture, where scientists and doctors are people who get at universal truths about how the body works or illness or health. And then those lessons can be applied regardless of the cultural context. What's so interesting about circumcision, which is a genital procedure, I mean, the name can sometimes refer to female genital cutting and sometimes to male genital cutting, but in the Western discourse, circumcision usually refers to removal of the penile foreskin. This is a practice that's mixed up in medicine in a really interesting way, because you'll find that doctors from different cultural backgrounds will often make sharply different claims about seemingly neutral scientific facts. So just to illustrate that, I was raised in the United States, where newborn circumcision is basically a cultural practice, even outside of religious communities. There's an interesting history as to why that is the case, and I could maybe share some of that. But basically, just routinely, boys in the United States, when they're in the hospital, will often undergo a surgery to remove part of their penis, the skin that covers the head of the penis. And medical doctors in the United States will tend to justify this using medical language. So they'll often say that it's hygienic or it may have some health benefits. But ultimately, if you look at other comparable nations, say in Europe, that have similar healthcare systems, similar medical ethical presumptions, you'll find that doctors in those countries will draw the opposite conclusion. They'll say, well, this isn't really a medical practice because the child's healthy. There's no disease to treat. The arguments about health benefits they find very unconvincing. And they say, well, it's a surgery, so it carries risks. And generally, from a medical ethics perspective, if you're going to expose somebody to surgical risk, you would have to make sure that that's the most conservative way of addressing a disease that they have, or some sort of, clear deformity where you've already exhausted the more conservative methods, especially if you're performing a surgery on a part of the body that's very psychosexually significant. And so I was fascinated about this because I spent some time in England as well as in the United States, and I was reading the different medical policies of European doctors and American doctors who were ostensibly looking at the very same scientific literature. And when you see that they reach opposite conclusions about even basic questions of benefit and risk, you start to realize that medicine is baked through as cultural presumptions from the very beginning. It doesn't stand outside of culture as its own objective institution that's uninfluenced by value judgments. And maybe I'll even just illustrate this last point in terms of how the value judgments of a medical professional or a scientist can influence their conclusions about seemingly neutral, objective scientific facts. So in the United States, most medical doctors who are reading the scientific literature about the health benefits or risks of circumcision, male circumcision, are either males who themselves were circumcised in infancy, or females who don't have the tissue in question. They don't have a penile foreskin. Although importantly, females have a clitoral foreskin, which is homologous tissue. And in some cultures, the female foreskin is also circumcised. So we'll come on to that. European doctors, by contrast, if they're males, overwhelmingly will have this tissue on their body. It won't have been removed in infancy. And they assign a positive value to the tissue. They think it's a good part of their body that they like and enjoy and that's relevant to their sexual experience. So when they're reading the literature, they would be thinking, well, I obviously wouldn't want to sacrifice this part of my body unless I really had to, unless there was some urgent medical emergency. And so if there are these health benefits, they would have to be significant, and they would have to be the sorts of things that you can't achieve non-surgically. Whereas American medical doctors who don't have this tissue, they would say, well, I don't have a foreskin and I'm fine. So I assume a foreskin is just not worth anything. And so I assign it a value of 0. And then the question is just, well, are there any health benefits that follow from this practice that we do culturally in this country? And so their entire approach to reading the literature is different. And this can start to explain why you get, vastly different evaluations of seemingly, one same objective literature.
So what I can understand from this is that a large part of it is rooted in bodily autonomy, in how we, perceive our body and how we perceive the rights that we get with our body. So, and because circumcision and genital mutilation, it happens very young when children are very young or when they're babies. So what do you think happens when this sort of thing happens to a child, to a minor who cannot actually voice their opinion?
So people who are supportive of childhood genital cutting, whether of females or males, or I will say of children with intersex characteristics, which is a set of surgeries that people are now more familiar with, but basically a small percentage of children are born with genitalia that are neither clearly or unambiguously female typical or male typical. And often doctors still today will treat this as an emergency, and they think, well, the child should look like a boy or a girl in a conventional way. And so they'll perform sometimes radical surgeries to try to superficially shape the genitals into a stereotypically masculine or feminine appearance. And again, the child doesn't have any choice in this. So many intersex advocates will say, that's a pretty radical change to make to a person's body. You're exposing a private part of their body to a lot of risk. And so you might cause nerve damage, things that could cause problems for them sexually later in life. Why don't you just let the child grow up and decide for themselves? Similarly, internationally, it's widely accepted that girls who have healthy genitalia, who don't have any kind of disease, shouldn't undergo any form of genital cutting unless they're old enough to decide if that's something that they want. Now, of course, this is largely a quote unquote Western position that's imposed on certain other countries and cultures where female circumcision is seen as just as normal and appropriate as male circumcision is seen. And so I'll talk, for example, about Malaysia and Indonesia, Sri Lanka, parts of Thailand, parts of India. There are forms of female circumcision that are done in a hospital right in the same way that male circumcision is done by medical professionals who will often cite health benefits for this procedure. And so that's now becoming more central to the conversation in the United States and the United Kingdom because some recent court cases have drawn attention to this practice. In the case of boys, it's also true that they don't have any say in whether this happens to them. And then they may grow up and get on the internet and do a little research and say, oh, wait a minute, I was subjected to a surgery when I was an infant and somebody took off part of my body. Well, why did they do that? And many of them start to come into a sort of an awareness where they say, well, was that really necessary that happened? And then when they learn it was more of a cultural practice or something that wasn't medically necessary, many of them are really startled by this because they think, I was raised in a culture that, as you suggest, says that we should have autonomy over our bodies. So, children from a very young age are told that no one should even touch their genitals, much less remove tissue from them, unless they're old enough to understand what's at stake in that, unless they agree to it, they consent to it. And so this is a very anomalous practice here where we, without a medical indication, preemptively interfere with the sexual anatomy of a person when they're at their absolutely most vulnerable. And so there's a growing movement of bioethicists to say, unless there's a medical emergency, which everyone would agree is a legitimate reason to perform a surgery on someone, even if they're not yet autonomous, if there isn't a medical emergency, you should not interfere with a person's sexual anatomy, and you should allow them to make this decision for themselves. And so that's now where the conversation starts to be headed. And importantly, that principle applies to children regardless of their sex characteristics. So whether you have female typical genitalia, male typical genitalia, or intersex traits, all children have an interest in being able to make this kind of very personal decision for themselves.
That's really interesting. But recently we are seeing that there's a lot of controversy regarding the the sides that are being taken regarding circumcision. So, like major authorities in medicine, like the WHO and the American Academy of Pediatrics, so they have always maintained the stance that any form of non-medical female genital mutilation is wrong. But we don't see any particular stance from their side when it comes to male genital mutilation, or when it comes to non-medical circumcision on young boys. So do you think this is kind of hypocritical that you have a very strong stance towards one particular gender and not towards the other?
The short answer is that it's very inconsistent, that there are double standards. But of course, double standards always come about because of complicated historical reasons. And so it's not that somebody woke up one day and said, you know what, I think we should treat boys and girls fundamentally differently in terms of their genital integrity. No one thinks that. But that's the effect of the policy. So the World Health Organization policy is very heavily influenced by scholarship that comes out of the 1970s. And unfortunately, it really is that out of date. In the 1970s, some feminist advocates who had a superficial understanding of female genital cutting practices in Northeast Africa, which are among the most invasive, they're the most severe or shocking to Western consciousness, began to characterize these kinds of cutting practices as a form of gender-based violence. Now, this is already a little bit questionable because in every culture that practices what they would call female circumcision or female genital cutting of some kind, obviously the practicing cultures don't regard it as mutilation, although some who are affected by it do regard themselves as having been mutilated. There's always also a male genital cutting ritual in the same society. So there are no societies, virtually no societies, that only cut the genitals of girls. So if you want to characterize it as gender-based violence, you have to start to come up with a more sophisticated account of the sense in which it's discriminating against girls. But anyway, what would happen is these early observers who were coming in from a Western context and didn't really understand the gender systems of the cultures that they were evaluating, they were ignoring what was happening to the boys. They don't even mention that the boys are also undergoing genital cutting. And then they look at this thing happening to the genitals of girls and they assume it's a form of men trying to dominate women, which was part of the concern of second wave feminism, that there's this global patriarchy that needs to be contested. And what could be better evidence of that, that even in these far-flung parts of Africa, you find men dominating women by trying to, as it were, control their sexuality. So the first point to make about this is just that there are some contexts in which that's a reasonably good description of what's going on, where a desire to control women's ability to have sex before marriage, for example, is part of the explicit intention of the genital cutting. The problem is that female and male genital cutting exists in a wide variety of forms all around the world. And by focusing just on this one case that's the most extreme, the most obviously sex discriminatory or patriarchal in nature, and then assuming that all female genital cutting is just the same way without taking into account cultural variance, there was created a stereotype in the Western consciousness, which is that whenever female genital cutting happens, it must be because it's trying to diminish or otherwise control or impair girls. Therefore, it's just fundamentally different from the kind of thing that happens to boys in Western countries, namely the United States in particular, which of course has a very profound influence on global policymaking. So when female genital cutting was brought into Western consciousness, it was as a gender-based issue. Meanwhile, male genital cutting has been familiar to Western consciousness for many centuries through contact with Judaism. And then also in the United States, since the late 1800s, it's been a cultural practice in the United States, and it's been normalized within the medical culture of the United States, which funds most of the world's research and sets most of the global policy priorities in terms of what's considered to be a rights violation and what isn't. So let me add another thought to this. There's some interesting sociological research of human rights decision makers at the United Nations. The World Health Organization is part of the United Nations, showing that when you ask these gatekeepers of human rights, why do they think female genital mutilation is a human rights violation? They'll often appeal to that stereotypical form I mentioned. They assume that it's this very harmful, sexually damaging form. They ignore the less severe forms. They don't tend to talk about those forms. But they'll also say, well, it's just a violation of her right to bodily integrity. This is, it's medically unnecessary. Therefore, she should be able to make her own decision. That's one of the things that they'll say. And this researcher then asks these same people, well, what about male circumcision, which also is done without a medical indication and which obviously violates the bodily integrity of the boy. So if it's a human rights violation, it should obviously apply regardless of the sex or the gender of the person. A human right is a human right. It isn't a sex-based right. And what this researcher, Charlie Carpenter, found is that these human rights gatekeepers overwhelmingly practice male circumcision in their own families. So there was a very large percentage of them who had circumcised their own sons, and they didn't want to think of themselves as human rights violators. That would be absurd. It's only those Africans who are human rights violators. And so they were loath to apply the same standard to their own cultural practice, and they found it very offensive that the researcher was even proposing that there could be some sort of rights violation that they were committing within their own family, because by gosh, they were the ones who decide what counts as a rights violation. And so there's a very strong cultural bias in terms of what is characterized as a rights violation. If something is a common cultural practice in a rich country of the global north, such as the United States, it tends to become invisible. It tends to become the sort of thing that, well, obviously it's not a rights violation because we're civilized and we call the shots as to what is a good practice and a bad practice. And then if you want to try to criticize the cultural practices of poorer countries of the global south, it's very convenient if you just focus on the most extreme and shocking instances of that practice and sort of ignore the practices that maybe are more obviously comparable to what's done in your country. So this is something that scholars have known since the 1970s. There have been many, many critiques for decades made against the World Health Organization. But because it's such a powerful institution, its highly culturally biased and inconsistent view of human rights, I put it in quotations because it's just not serious. If they really think it's a human rights violation to prick the clitoral hood of a girl, which they do, without removing tissue and without causing long-term difficulties, and they don't think it's a human rights violation to remove a third of the erogenous tissue of the penis, then that's not a serious view about human rights. That's just the cultural bias. And so they're using the language of human rights to effectively criticize the practices of culturally less powerful groups. And they're not applying the same standard to the cultural practices of dominant groups in the global north.
Yeah, that's a very interesting perspective to it. So a large part of this whole practice is very religiously dominated. So do you think that there is a certain group of people that believe that this practice should be allowed, that if consented, this should be allowed? So is genital mutilation or genital cutting or circumcision per se, can that be a tool for religious freedom and religious expression as well?
Sure. So one point to make is just that whatever a society decides on this question, they have to treat different religious groups equally. So if you think that the religious beliefs of the parents is a sufficient justification to perform a medically unnecessary, non-consensual genital surgery on their child, then you can't only say that for some groups and not for others. So this has recently come to the fore in the United States, also in England and Australia, because there are a community of Shia Muslims called the Dawoodi Bohra that practice what they call khatna, which is an Arabic word for circumcision, but it's a gender-neutral word. So they perform circumcision by their lights on both boys and girls. What's interesting about their practice is, well, several things are interesting. One is that the form of cutting that they do to the girls typically is the nicking, pricking, or partial removal of the clitoral hood. So they don't tend to damage the external clitoris. They don't tend to remove labial tissues. And in some cases, they don't remove any tissue. So the form of cutting that's done to the girls is, on any view, less substantial, less invasive than what they do to those girls' brothers within the same families. The boys will have a large proportion of the penile skin system removed, and there will be a scar. It will be very obvious that they underwent a surgery. In the case of the girls, sometimes there's no visual evidence of any surgery having happened, and so you actually have to come up with a different set of evidence for whether something happened because you can't see any change to the genitals. And so a further point about this is that, maybe I'll put it this way. In any culture that practices child genital cutting, from the perspective of the parents, they see it as something that's good for the child. Now, they don't always think it's medically good for the child, although they may grasp for medical reasons for doing it, but they may think it's spiritually good for the child, or they may think it's culturally good for the child because it helps integrate the child into an ancestral community or something like that. So what's very interesting is that in, say, Orthodox Judaism, there's this idea that circumcision is the religiously most significant rite of the entire religion, but only boys are, as it were, allowed to participate in this rite. There isn't an equivalent rite for girls. And if you read Jewish scholarship on rabbinical Judaism, the consensus is that girls and women in this classically patriarchal religion were not considered worthy of having a circumcision ritual. So they were excluded from this practice, and they were othered and treated as sort of inferior in this religious context. And so if you have a culture that values circumcision but excludes girls from the ritual, if you're concerned about sex-based discrimination, you should actually be concerned about the exclusion of girls from a practice that, by the lights of the community, is seen as spiritually significant. What's very interesting about the Dawoodi Bohra is that they think girls should be included in this important spiritual practice as they see it. But they think that what happens to the girls should be less physically severe than what happens to the boys. So in one view, what the Dawoodi Bohra are doing is they're saying we're treating boys and girls equally. We think circumcision is not only okay, but good for boys, and we think circumcision is good for girls. And so we think boys and girls should be treated equally. They should both be, as they would say, circumcised. So this is just creating a lot of difficulties in terms of the legal response in the United States, the UK, and Australia, because in all of those countries, there's a zero tolerance law against any form of medically unnecessary female genital cutting. And so when the Dawoodi Bohra have tried to carry on their gender-inclusive practice of circumcision, as soon as they nick the clitoral prepuce of the girls within the community, they become suspected criminals because they're now violating federal criminal law. Whereas if they do a much more severe practice to the boys for the same reasons, religious reasons, then that's invisible to Western law because, of course, Westerners do that to their boys. So it's not seen as a problem. And so this is the sort of thing where it's going to have to be sorted out what our judgment is as to the religious justifications for a given practice of genital cutting. So, a Muslim religious circumciser within the Dawoodi Bohra, who may even be trained as a doctor using sterile instruments and so forth, doing this under the clinically most responsible conditions, if they'll face criminal charges and potentially spending years in jail. Whereas a Jewish moil who performs a more invasive procedure on the body of an equally non-consenting infant faces no criminal consequences. And that's just fundamentally unjust. It's unjust on grounds of sex discrimination. So male bodily integrity and female bodily integrity are treated differently. And it's unjust on grounds of religious discrimination. Muslims and Jews are being treated differently. And so somehow that has to be worked out because whatever our principle is, we have to apply it equally to everyone. We can't selectively allow for the practices of some religious groups whom we favor and then discriminate against other religious groups who are seen as less established within our culture.
Yeah. So since this is largely imposed on children because it's a cultural practice, and so do you think it can be very conflicting for a child to understand that on one hand, they are being taught that this is your identity as a religious being. But on the other hand, they're also being taught that this part of your body is very private. So on one hand, it's like a public ceremony, even though there are not public eyes on the ceremony. But on the other hand, you're also teaching a child that, this is a very private part of your life. So can it be, so how far does it go with child psychology, and because of federal laws on child psychology, how do you kind of balance this aspect of this religious ceremony with law?
That is a really, really good and difficult question. So I'll answer it by first making a comment about male and female genital cutting as they're typically performed within the African context. So there are many different ethnic groups that have different versions of this, but typically it's done around puberty. and it's done as a rite of passage into adulthood. So the individual is still very vulnerable. They're often young. They may be 12 or 13. They're facing an extraordinary cultural pressure to undergo the practice, whether they're a boy or a girl. And if they don't do it, they will be teased and bullied and harassed and seen as immature. And they want to be treated as an adult within their society. And so many of these young adults or adolescents will look forward to this rite of passage because, one, to try to now eliminate the bullying that they're being exposed to, which is an important consideration. But two, they actually want to be dignified by the lights of their culture. They want to become adults. And the way you become an adult in these cultures is to undergo a painful rite of passage where you make a sacrifice. You have a part of your genitals cut off. And if you can withstand the pain, and if you can show that you are courageous, then you come through this ritual and you feel like, now I'm an adult by the lights of my community. So in the African context, there's at least this conscious awareness in the case where the children are older. Again, I have to say this just as an aside. Because female genital cutting is now more and more controversial through Western activism, what's happening is it's being driven underground and it's done to younger and younger girls. So if you do it out in the open in a public ceremony in the way that I'm describing, which is the traditional way of doing it, then it catches the attention of whoever is opposed to the practice. And so now it's sort of done in secret sometimes in somebody's living room to a girl who's so young she doesn't even understand what the point of it is. Maybe she doesn't understand. Maybe she can't even speak if it's done to an infant. And so there's a change in the practice happening because people are trying to adapt to the Western model where we, i.e. people in the United States, circumcise boys in infancy when they're too young to understand what's happening. So to just step back and make the point again, in some cultures, genital cutting is done, as it were, with eyes wide open. The children are definitely exposed to quite a lot of social pressure. It's not that it's just a free choice, but they have been trained as to the cultural meanings and the significance of what they're about to go through. And so they may be able to make sense of it as something that they are willing to undergo to gain acceptance by the community. What happens in the United States and in parts of, say, Malaysia and Indonesia, where female circumcision is done sometimes to infant girls, is that people only find out that something happened to them later in life. And this is a very interesting consequence for one's psychology. So if I grow up within a culture, and as you say, I've been told that my genitals are private and I should get to decide what happens to them, but then at some point I find out that before I was even capable of making a decision, someone made a permanent decision regarding my genitals that maybe I wouldn't necessarily share. Sometimes what you have is a psychological crisis where either you have to say, well, that's fine. I mean, I don't want to get upset about this, so I'm just going to assume that circumcision's great. And I'm going to do it to my children. And I don't want to really think about this too hard. And then you sort of carry on the practice because you don't want to confront the fact that maybe something wrong happened to you. On the other hand, you have people who say, well, no, I think it's right to say that children, any child should be able to grow up and make a decision about this part of their body. And now I'm actually quite upset about what happened to me. And there's nothing I can do to reverse it. It's permanent. Once somebody's cut your genitals, you can't uncut them. And so the way that many young people, as they grow up and gain an awareness of what happened to them when they were at their most vulnerable, is that they face this psychological crossroads. Either they have to go into a state of sort of denial and convince themselves that this is appropriate that their genitals were interfered with, or many of them just have a paradigm shift and they can't stop thinking about it. So for many people, including people people within Jewish communities, people in Muslim communities, they'll have sort of an epiphany and they'll say, this is something I'm really objecting to, and I want to now change the practice within my culture. And they think about it all the time because they feel violated. They feel like some part of their sexual anatomy was inappropriately interfered with. So the psychological response is different for everybody. Everybody has to deal with it. It depends on the cultural context. It depends on how common it is in the society. If you're part of a minority group that practices it, but it's not common in the wider culture, it may be something that you confront in a different way. If, as it were, everybody does it, it might be harder for you to even think of it as something that maybe is a problem. So there isn't any one answer that I can give you other than to say that there's a built-in tension here in any society that socializes children to say that their genitals are private and ought not to be interfered with. And any child who socialized in that society who also had their genitals interfered with surgically is potentially, anyway, going to have to confront a very serious issue. And it can, for some people, be psychologically all-consuming.
And I think that's a really big dichotomy that the law has to overcome. And so I had another question regarding consensual mutilation cutting. So largely we identify female genital mutilation as a mutilation. So since it is a mutilation, there is a sort of criminality that we attach to it. So if one is consenting to this form of circumcision, whether it's for boys or whether it's for girls, would it still be called mutilation? Wouldn't that just be an amendment of your body? Does that? I hope I'm able to come across clear.
So you're making a good point, and this is something I've written about. Mutilation is obviously a value-laden judgment. It's not a neutral term. It means basically a change to the body that someone thinks is bad. Exactly. If you have a change to your body that you like, you wouldn't call it a mutilation. You'd call it an enhancement. So I'll use an example of so-called cosmetic labioplasty, where in many Western countries, adult women or even sometimes older adolescent girls will willingly or voluntarily, albeit under various problematic cultural pressures, they will decide to have their labia removed. Now, labia are healthy genital tissue that serve various functions. They're sexually sensitive. It's valuable tissue, but some people just prefer the way their body looks without this tissue, and so they undergo a surgery to have it removed. If somebody willingly undergoes this surgery, no one would say, you're mutilating yourself. They would just acknowledge that the person feels that they're undergoing a cosmetic enhancement. Similarly, if somebody has their nose altered for a cosmetic rhinoplasty, you might think that there are various ethical reasons why they shouldn't feel the need to do this. But if they do it, no one would say, you've undergone a nose mutilation. They'd say you've undergone what you take to be an enhancement to your body. The same thing applies to breast augmentation or breast diminishment for people who feel that their breasts are larger than they would like. If they undergo the procedure, nobody would say you've undergone a breast mutilation. They would say you've undergone a cosmetic surgery. And so the way we label things reflects our values. If we label something a mutilation, it just means we think it's a bad change to the body. If somebody else chooses that very same intervention, they would regard it as a bodily enhancement. So the key difference here is choice. Did you decide that this is something you wanted for yourself because you regard it as an improvement to your body? Or is this something that was imposed on you and that you regard as a negative change to your body? Now, I don't think we should invoke the language of mutilation for childhood genital cutting as a blanket statement because we don't know how the person is going to feel about it. If take a boy in the United States who was circumcised in infancy and who perhaps through, adaptive preference formation or something actually says, yeah, I actually prefer to be circumcised. I like it this way. I think it's better. If I were to go around and say, no, you've been genitally mutilated because it was medically unnecessary and non-consensual, I'm now forcing an interpretive lens on them that they may rightly reject. They may say, listen, I know it wasn't consensual, and maybe I can hear your argument that that's a reason why it's something that shouldn't be done going forward. But listen, I like my body the way it is, and I don't want you to tell me that I'm mutilated because I don't agree with you that that's the best way to characterize my bodily state. Well, similarly, many women who undergo what the World Health Organization by definitional fiat describes as genital mutilation, they were raised in a culture where modified vulva are considered beautiful, are considered healthier, are considered civilized, are considered dignified, and so on. And so they grow up saying, I prefer my genitalia this way. Now, again, if you've had part of your body permanently altered without your consent, it's useful for you to come to think that it's a good thing. Otherwise, as I said, you're going to have to be confronted with very negative thoughts. So perhaps it's an adaptive preference. But when many of these women migrate to Western communities and they start looking at the World Health Organization, which defines their body as mutilated, regardless of what happened, regardless of whether they actually have any functional difficulties, regardless of whether they think it aesthetically looks better, this can be devastating to their bodily self-image. And so many women will start to feel, rather than beautiful and dignified and enhanced, which is how they had felt before, suddenly they feel disgusted with themselves. They feel that they are ugly. They feel that no one will accept them as a sexual partner. They feel sexually damaged, even if they're capable of experiencing sexual pleasure. And so I think what we should talk about is genital cutting, which is a neutral term. That's correct. In all these cases, genital cutting occurs. And then we should allow the individual who is affected by it to decide how they feel about their own body. If they, even just to sort of preserve their psychological integrity, decide that they feel enhanced, that should be their choice. the problem is people have to decide why they think genital cutting of children is wrong. I think it's wrong because it's non-consensual, it targets the sexual anatomy, and there isn't a medical emergency. Those are sufficient conditions to say why it shouldn't be done. It's not wrong because it's mutilation. That's just a confusion. Mutilation means, or it implies, a harmful change to the body. And then people say, well, it's wrong because it's harmful. But it's like, is cosmetic labioplasty harmful? Well, it certainly involves surgical risk. It's painful. It removes functional tissue. But some people think that that's worth it for what they take to be an improvement to their body. So clearly the issue there is not level of harm. That's not what makes it wrong. It's, was it chosen or not? And if it was chosen, then the person can decide that they think it's an enhancement. And we shouldn't suggest that it's wrong simply because it removes healthy functional tissue.
I think that's a very, very interesting perspective. I think bioethics in itself is such an interesting field of research, because on one hand you have biology, which we have always been taught is so factual, and it's always, what is, that's the end of it. And on the other hand, you have ethics, which is so subjective. Ethics like, a kilometer from here, the ethical understanding of a particular issue might be different. But it's really great to see that you're researching on something that is so conflicting, that it has such a major social dimension, it has such a major legal dimension, and yet there's at present no answers. So I guess that gives your research a lot of value.
One thing about whether ethical judgments are subjective, there's a lot of debate about that, but there's one sense in which many moral judgments are at the very least not totally relative to each individual. So it's not like, well, I have my own ethical opinion and you have your ethical opinion, and there's no fact of the matter. Many groups of people have shared moral intuitions, and they actually make shared moral judgments. What happens often is that they just fail to apply those judgments consistently. So in many cultures around the world, pretty much everybody agrees that it's wrong to non-consensually interfere with someone's genitalia. That's a deep principle, not just in quote unquote Western countries, but in many parts of the world. And then when you have a practice that came about, thousands of years ago, when children were considered property, and they weren't considered to have, ownership over their own bodies, that's been preserved into the modern era, where again, across many cultural contexts, people understand that children aren't just property. Children are moral agents that have worth in their own right, and they have a developing autonomy and so forth. Now, there's different ways that cultures put weight on issues of autonomy versus, say, communal decision making or something like that. But very few cultures just think that you don't have any right to say no to an infringement in your body. Almost every culture thinks that there's some value to having a certain kind of dominion over your own bodily sphere. Pretty much every culture recognizes, for example, the concept of an assault legally. And an assault is a non-consensual infringement into your body. And so this, by the way, affects the legal interpretation of genital cutting. And I'll just try to make this point briefly. In the United States, this group I mentioned, the Dawoodi Bohra, were recently accused of FGM, or female genital mutilation, according to the federal statute in the United States. And again, the Dawoodi Bohra practice nicking, pricking, or partial removal of the clitoral hood. That's the form of female circumcision, as they would say, that they perform. And the judge who ruled on this case said, this action, this pricking, nicking, or partial removal of the clitoral hood, doesn't have to be banned by some federal statute. And actually, the judge struck down the federal statute and said it was unconstitutional. The judge said, this is already illegal because it is the crime of physical assault and battery. It's already an assault. You don't have to have an FGM statute. You can't just cut somebody's body without their consent or without an urgent medical indication. Otherwise, imagine what the implications would be. If we thought that parents could just decide to cut their children, if they felt that it was in the child's best interest, all sorts of practices would suddenly become acceptable. So the whole point of having a notion of assault, which applies especially to vulnerable people, we should be especially concerned if you assault the body of somebody who can't defend themselves. The point is, circumcision is already an assault. And the thing is, if pricking the clitoral hood is a physical assault, then obviously excising the penile prepuce is a physical assault as well, unless it's consented or there's an urgent medical need such that the person isn't capable of consenting to it in order for it to do its medical work. So, there's a sense in which some moral judgments are highly culturally variable. There's a sense in which even between two individuals, we might strongly disagree about the ethics of abortion or something like that. But the way that I try to make my bioethical arguments is I say, let's start with where we agree. We pretty much all agree that the genitals are special. And we all agree that it's good for children to learn that adults shouldn't be interfering with their genitals. So if we agree on that, what the heck are we doing with this surgery that we perform on children's genitals that is not medically necessary? And I'm just trying to say, by your own lights, even assuming that you agree on these moral principles, shouldn't you apply them equally to boys, to girls, to intersex children, to Muslims, to Jews, to white people, to African immigrants? You should be discriminating on the basis of these characteristics as long as you think that this is a fundamental principle, which, again, almost everybody in this discourse does.
Yeah, that's a very good perspective. This is something that's very niche, especially for young law students, and I think it's very inspirational also because not only does it, because it forces you to think a lot more about bodily autonomy than the general education has taught us. So it was really amazing to talk with you, Brian. And I hope you contribute to JURIST more in the future. And I hope we have more conversations like these. And I wish you all the very best for your research.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Thank you for your really good questions. And yeah, I'd be happy to come back anytime to talk about these things some more.
All the best. And thank you so much for coming forward and talking about all of this and sharing your opinion.
Thank you.